Ready to go!
You're listening to By Land and by Sea, powered by the Maritime Professor. When people talk about the supply chain, they usually talk about ships, trucking, rail, maybe warehouses. But there's a moment in the system where global ocean trade physically connects with the U.S. economy, and vice versa. The port terminal. It's where containers move off a vessel and into trucks and rail, where global shipping becomes domestic commerce, and domestic commerce goes out into the world. And if you want to understand how cargo actually moves and how the broader maritime industry is evolving, the port terminal is a very good place to start. So that's where we're starting today. Today we're talking to someone who operates right at the center of that system. Hi, welcome back to By Land and by Sea, an attorney breaking down the week in supply chain, presented by the Maritime Professor, me. I'm Lauren Began, founder of the Maritime Professor, former FMC International Affairs attorney, and founder of Squall Strategies. By Land and by Sea is your go-to resource for navigating the regulatory side of global ocean shipping. And me? I'm your favorite maritime attorney. As always, this podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be considered legal advice. There is no attorney-client privilege created by this video or this podcast. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. So let's get into it because, as you know, ocean shipping moves the world. Well, today I'm joined by Matt Leech, President and CEO of Ports America. I am so excited to be bringing you this conversation. Ports America, as you probably know, operates terminals across the United States and works with shipping lines, port authorities, labor, trucking, and rail, all combined to move cargo through U.S. ports. Matt has spent more than 3 decades in the container shipping and terminal industry, including leadership roles at Sealand. We're going to talk about Sealand in this conversation, CSX World Terminals, and DP World before ultimately becoming the CEO of Ports America. And before we jump into this conversation, I do want to thank the team at Ports America for helping to facilitate this interview and for taking the time to share their perspective with the audience. So with that, let's get into the conversation. Talking about one of the core pieces of the global supply chain, port terminal operations. When cargo arrives in the United States on a container ship, the terminal is where global ocean shipping connects with the domestic economy. It's where containers move from ship to shore and then into trucks, rail, and the rest of the supply chain. If you want to understand how trade actually moves and what policy conversations around maritime strength or supply chain resilience might mean in practice, the port terminal is a very good place to start. And that's why I'm excited about today's guest. Matt Leech is the president and CEO of Ports America, the largest terminal operator in stevedore in the United States. He brings more than 3 decades of experience that we're going to be breaking down in a little bit in the container transportation industry, including leadership roles at DP World, CSX World Terminals, and Sealand Service, all of which I think you probably would like to know more about. He has worked in all of these places. So today we're going to talk about his path into the maritime industry, what Ports America actually does in the supply chain, the significance, and how current maritime policy initiatives, including the Maritime Action Plan and the push to strengthen U.S. maritime capability, intersect with port operations. So Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Lauren. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we're so happy to have you here. I think that the audience is really going to gain today from just your experience and all of the stories that you've already been sharing with me about the way that the industry has changed. I'm so excited to get into it.
Well, it's been very dynamic, certainly
right.
over my 3 decades, 30 years, now 31 in the industry. It's one thing we all say, it changes every day.
That's right. That's right. And now people are paying attention to it, which is also a fantastic place for us to be. Well, let's start before we go too far into anything else. Let's start at the beginning so people can get to know you a little bit more. So you studied economics at Georgetown and you later earned your MBA from the University of Maryland. Now, what drew you into those fields? And then how did you translate that into transportation and logistics?
Yeah, so again, I kind of went to Georgetown, come from a big engineering family, so engineer at heart, and made that choice to spread a little bit and not be an engineer, and went to Georgetown to get a broad-based liberal arts education, and from that was very attracted to economics and finance. It's almost kind of the translation of what I call engineering in mathematics into a slightly different field. And so that was really my start. And from that went into banking, mostly real estate development in Washington. and looking at a transition. Next step was MBA, and post MBA, I was really looking to go into asset management. So kind of pairing up investment with assets, but not just do it on Wall Street, not just do it from a kind of transitional investor perspective, do it from in-house, live with it, because assets are about time, and really driving value requires time. And for me, my pleasure, my enjoyment came from building over long periods of time. And it just so happened I was relocating to Charlotte at the same time Sealand was doing a consolidation of its US headquarters and going to a single headquarters location in Charlotte. And the two just were a happenstance, came together perfectly, both from time and opportunity perspective.
That's so interesting. And you saying that you were kind of an engineering minded family to go into economics and then later banking and real estate. I mean, all of these things are such pivotal pieces for the foundation for working well inside the industry. I mean, you have to have real estate, right? And as waterfront property becomes more expensive, you got to understand the real estate side of it all. But the banking and the finance and the matching all of that with probably a methodical mind of engineering matched with the economics of it all. I mean, that sets you up well to be dangerous in the supply chain world, in the logistics world.
I think it set me up to be very strategic. And that was my kind of entry point into Sealand. My very first job was in strategic planning and carrier alliances. So that was my entry point kind of into the industry. And that really was certainly encouraged by mentors I developed and had at Sealand kind of going into that, for me, a brand new industry. I looked at the industry with kind of open eyes as brand new, applying what I knew before into an industry coming in, learning as I went, but a fresh look. And that was really unique in terms of that culture inside of Sealand where you could go in, bring solutions, create opportunity, and that was encouraged. And it was really the ethos inside of Sealand from the very beginning when I came in '95, and I knew that from everybody. That was the culture. It was a culture of go get it done, figure out a way, provide a solution, create value, go next.
So Sealand,
that was kind of how I went into Sealand with all of that kind of opportunity ahead of me, bringing that mindset to the job.
So you started as a manager for strategic planning, right? Like I said, all of these components made you very good at strategy. You quickly moved up to director of strategic planning, but I want to kind of stop here at Sealand. So those in the maritime industry have heard of Sealand before. Those adjacent to the maritime industry may or may not have. It's only been about 25, 26 years since Sealand went away, but this was the leading ocean carrier in the world, and it was
world's largest container line,
largest
international container line
company.
the day I joined. Part of the attractiveness of going to Sealand and going into the maritime industry was you were joining the #1 international container line in the world that had the DNA of being the founding company for containerization through Malcolm McLean in 1956. So you had that predecessor DNA, and now you go into the industry #1.
Yeah.
It can only go up, right? It's only forward opportunity. Markets are growing, trade, there's still a huge, huge runway.
Too big to go away. Too big to go away, right? Well, and that's it too. So you mentioned Malcolm McLean. So the father of the box, right? He was a trucker who saw kind of piecemeal break bulk operations at the terminal and said, there's got to be a better way. And that's where we created the TEU, the actual box. But Malcolm McLean was also the godfather of this ocean shipping network, the Sealand. Can you talk to me a little bit more, just for the listeners who aren't as familiar? You said Sealand. I mean, when we talk about the largest ocean carrier company in the world, I mean, right now we're talking MSC, Maersk, some of the largest ones. This was bigger than that. And so when we say, big bad ocean carriers, we were that big bad ocean carrier for a while. So yeah, talk to me a little bit more about Sealand and the significance. You touched on it, but a little bit more about how it factored into the U.S. economy.
It was the backbone. It was the foundation of U.S. economy. And quite frankly, trade still is today. It's just which ocean liner is carrying that box is very, very different. So I think people just have to understand kind of our economy is so dependent, and our economic growth thesis is so dependent on international trade, and international trade is so dependent on containerization, that those simply build in steps. So The only difference we have from then to now is the preponderance of U.S. international trade was carried by U.S. Owned and managed companies, from Sealand to APL, right? You go down the line, right, to Waterman's of the world. You just kept going down the line to Likes. That's changed today, right? It is not, the ecosystem is not there. But if we look back 30 years ago, what portion of U.S. trade was on a U.S. company service, U.S. owned company managing containers? I suspect it was clearly, probably a majority. I don't have that data handy, but if I kind of look at market share of APL and Sealand alone, certainly over 35%. And that was, in the mid 90s. Today, it's U.S. owned companies running international container lines is effectively zero.
There's a few. To be fair, there's a few.
It's effectively.
There's a few. I want to be fair to our friends in the U.S.
we can. Okay, Matson does have an international service coming in, right? So there is one that we can identify.
Yeah,
but it is near zero. It's a big change overall from an industry perspective.
Yes, yeah, and that's right too. I mean, to go from the world leading, which was sold off in, I think you said 1999.
Yeah, December of 1999 was the transaction date.
Yeah. So to go from 26 years ago, 26 years and 2 months ago to now is such a change. So, well, let's keep going down your list of career path though. So you were at Sealand until 1999, and then it turned into CSX World Terminal.
So just transactionally, maybe I can talk about.
Yeah, please do.
What happened
because there's a connection. There's a nexus there,
right?
Well,
there's a connection and then a next. So in December of 1999, the international container assets plus a group of terminals were sold to AP Moller, the owner and operator of Maersk Line, as most people would know it today. So AP Moller being the group. So the brand was sold along with the ships, selection of terminals, and all of the international business. And then what CSX did at that time was spin off 3 separate companies. And one of those companies was called U.S. Ship Management, USSM, where they had a forward obligation as a U.S. enterprise to manage a couple of vessels that needed U.S. direct ownership that were part of the Maersk Go Forward network, mostly U.S. flagships. Then there was another enterprise called CSX Lines. That was the domestic liner business serving Hawaii, Alaska, Puerto Rico. And that was going to continue as owned by CSX. And then third was CSX World Terminals, which was the terminal operating company. And that company took all of the residual terminal assets that were not sold to AP Moller. So it was a bit of a mixed bag of terminals, were aggregated into a single enterprise, and that company then went forward as CSX World Terminals. So that was kind of the nexus, kind of post-December of 99 is moved into 2000. Sealand International now being integrated inside of Maersk Line, and the domestic service run as CSX Lines. This terminal group stood up as CSX World Terminals, and then the residual U.S. ship management on a go forward.
Well, and it was interesting. So as we were kind of prepping, I mentioned I didn't realize that CSX World Terminals actually owned Sealand Service at the time. And so you said it was funny, even though the brand Sealand Service had been sold off, SL still remained. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Well, so it's really kind of the other way around.
Okay.
So that CSX Lines, U.S. Ship Management, and the original Sealand International business were all effectively done as asset sales. Okay. So the residual enterprise that became CSX World Terminals was done under Sealand Service Inc. Now, Sealand Service Inc. had to be renamed to SL Service Inc. because the Sealand brand was sold to AP Moller. So the immediate subsidiary of SL Service Inc. became CSX World Terminals, that then went forward as a terminal operating company. And when that company was subsequently sold in 2004, what was sold to then DPI International, the Dubai entity, was actually SL Service Inc. on an equity deal. So Dubai became the owner, the heritage owner of the original SL Service, Sealand Service as SL Service Inc. and it remains operating today.
That's why. So Sealand still exists out there under SL,
Yes,
but it still exists in some form or fashion.
correct.
That's great. Well, so it's interesting too. One of the other things, and we prepped at TPM last week, which what a fantastic conference. But you had said that Sealand and Maersk actually have another American connection. So I know this to be at Mass Maritime Academy, actually just down the road here. They have a Maersk McKinney Moeller ship's bridge. It's the incredible 360 simulator for a bridge, but it's called the Maersk McKinney Moeller. And you said that name McKinney is actually extra interesting and has some American connections. Chastine McKinney, an American.
Right. So the McKinney connection was an American. So she was born in, I believe, in Kentucky,
Okay.
and by marriage married into the Moeller family, and so there is this unique Moeller Danish American component that even goes that really started kind of this American tie back. Also was part of kind of World War II history.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard it told by many members of the AP Moeller family, kind of this association. And I think it's, again, a remarkable piece of history of kind of why things are the way they are today. And that really related to, the potential takeover of Denmark by Germany during, as part of the war effort. And then the Moeller family bringing essentially their tonnage to the U.S. During the war, the Great War, World War II, in order to not have it taken over by Nazi Germany, brought it to the U.S., again, leveraging Anne McKinney's U.S. Citizenship status, and effectively took residence in New York and turned their assets over to the U.S. government to provide support on shipping for the war and on cargo shipping. So that is kind of this original association and more direct association and participation that, Maersk then established a U.S. enterprise that we now know today as Maersk Inc. And it has a very, very, kind of special relationship because of that kind of wartime effort that happened so long ago, and the marriage to Anne McKinney as an American. So
that's so interesting.
Yeah, it's just you get these dynamics in the industry, right? They go back a long time.
Yeah, it's funny. We had talked about all of that, and yet here I am still like, oh, I didn't know that. We could probably do this interview for 4 hours, and I would still find so many interesting facts in it. So but that's so fascinating too, to have that connection. I mean, it makes you, like I said, you think about these giant global ocean shipping companies, and often I'm trying to explain to people that even though they get a bad rap, they really do provide so much value and reliability. Well, there's such a necessary thing to the entire supply chain, but the US was right there with it. And now, certainly during COVID, people kind of came around to learning more about the ocean side of shipping. And you don't see the US really, I mean, right, to be honest, anywhere in there. You see it in domestic trade, but you don't see it really in any sort of scale that the rest of the companies are. But we were, and that's such a important piece of history that I'm so glad that we're capturing in this conversation, to make sure that people who are kind of unfamiliar, maybe they've heard of Sealand, but then to hear the kind of connections to the U.S. to Maersk is so fantastic. So
well, Lauren, I think we all have to recognize, in order to build a path of where we're going, we have to know where we came from.
That's right.
And so understanding that history and why things are the way they are, how we actually evolved, is very important to build a plan for the future. Yeah. And so I talk a lot about the past in that sense, that there's so much good things to celebrate. Do people actually understand how we got there and what happened along that journey to be able to then build the right path forward?
Yeah. And how we came away from there, right? How we built it, because we're building it again, but also what happened so that we don't fall into those same categories. And maybe it was just a successful sale, or maybe there was something that kind of led to December 1999 that put us in that position. But either way, I think that this is fantastic to have these conversations to really kind of help us structure where we go next. But so let's get back to your experience though, because after CSX World Terminals, then you were there for about 3 or 4.
So we ran for about 4.5 years.
Yep.
We took over. So I was, part of the executive team at CSX World Terminals, and we all knew kind of the outcome was build to sell. right? That this was a divestment, a long-term divestment plan by CSX, the CSX Corp, which prior, in the mid '90s was a transportation and real estate conglomerate, right? It had the railroad, which is what it's core today, but it had the international shipping. It had a logistics company, and it had the real estate in terms of Greenbrier. I think Grand Teton Lodge was included in that portfolio at one point in time. So it was this kind of based out of Richmond, this international transportation conglomerate that was going through an exercise to essentially transform into a pure railroad.
Okay.
And so part of that was sell down of a lot of assets. They went then into the Conrail deal and did the joint acquisition of Conrail with Norfolk Southern. And that then required the next step, which was, okay, Sealand was the last big asset left, divest Sealand, and then divest the residual pieces over a period of time. And so the first one to go in that was CSX Lines. And so it was the first, transaction to happen. And then we followed a couple of years later as CSX World Terminals went to market in the summer of 2004. A lot of interest in the acquisition of CSX World Terminals. And at the end, it came down to a two-party kind of bidding battle between PSA and DPI International, which was the international operating arm of the Dubai Port Authority at that point in time. So you had essentially two very large-scale authorities with international business, Singapore, Dubai, wanting and be very aggressive about buying CSX World Terminals. And so that was signed at the end of 2004 and then closed in February of 2005.
Oh, interesting. And so that's where we get to DP World. So, for those of the listeners who've never put it together, Dubai Ports, DP, right? DP World. So there it is. You hear the acronyms and you don't necessarily, sometimes you just figure it's based on somebody's
At the
initials
beginning,
or something.
all we heard was deep pockets. When they went out to do business.
Well, it worked. They bought it, right?
Right. Well, it's interesting because when we rolled out, it went out to Dubai as part of the executive team for then DPI International, and part of that then strategic work was the go forward, and then the decision to build out single commercial enterprise and unwind from the authority. And so, what was going to be the commercial vehicle? So the establishment of a new enterprise that was the commercial enterprise that was also not the authority. And unwinding that joining of the authority with the commercial operating company. And that then required the setup of a new enterprise and new brand and the establishment then of DP World. And rolling in, then taking the main asset that was in Dubai were the two ports, Port Rashid and Jebel Ali, and doing concessions for those from the authority, which would stay as the authority, to the new OpCo. So a lot of work to essentially set up DP World in that first year, and to go out to the world as here is this new commercial enterprise owned by Dubai that is operating as a pure commercial enterprise without this weird mix between an authority and an operator. And so that was kind of year one setup. Establish DP World and build all of the structure and process and governance around that new enterprise.
So prior to DP World, DPI taking over CSX World Terminals, and it was the terminals portfolio, right, that they were taking, and that's where it turned into this worldwide. Prior to that, they were just regionalized to Dubai, or
so DPI had already done a couple of transactions.
Okay.
Right. So they had the concession in Jeddah and the concession in Djibouti, and were bidding, and they may have just won the concession in Constanza. They had bid for Beirut and were not successful. So I think they had three international assets that were under DPI. So they dipped their toe in the water, had already established that the desire was to be more, at least be regional, but hopefully be more than regional.
Okay.
And prior to stepping in to be a bidder on the CSX World Terminal sale process, they were already looking at P&O Steam Navigation. So it was just a lot bigger as a transaction, right, to acquire P&O Steam Navigation than acquire CSX World Terminals. So essentially, that initiative on P&O Steam Navigation was parked, and then they simply went after kind of first step the baby step to do CSX World Terminals first, to create, kind of a broader portfolio, but also bring in, and I would say equally important, it wasn't just about the assets, the physical assets, it was about human assets, people. Who was going to provide kind of the leadership and backbone to set up a global organization?
Yeah.
And those are equally important kind of in that arena.
Yeah.
And doing so, they brought in several people, said, yes, I'll move to Dubai and I'll be part of this new initiative. It wasn't just Matt Leach. There were several of us that did that. And so that was kind of the inertia around from the Dubai perspective around the acquisition of CSL Terminals. It was the scale in terms of operating presence, but equally important, the opportunity to get talent.
Yeah. But that was part of the acquisition. I mean, as you're saying, right? You moved from, you obviously had the experience at Sealand, and then you moved over to CSX World Terminals. And then part of that acquisition was you into DP World. And so for the next 11 years, you were really part of the business development and expansion. And you went from business development into America's region, but you were still in Dubai, right? During that time.
Yeah. So I moved out to Dubai in the summer with the family in the summer of 2005, left the US and sold all of my assets in the U.S. My wife and I both grew up as expats. My children were my eldest was young enough, and my youngest was old enough. I had a great window where my youngest was just starting school, and my eldest was in middle school. So just starting middle school. So it was a great window in terms of taking a family outside of the U.S. from a school perspective. But we went to Dubai with every intent. We were staying. This was the next long-term job. Here was this new startup, effectively, of a global operating company. And it was a commitment to go and figure out what's next, but, with no real plan. It wasn't like, I'm going to go for 3 years and come back. It was a permanent move. And so went out in 2005 with the family. And my initial role there was leading all of the global business development activities for DP World. As part of that, setting that strategy and executing that growth strategy. And those were very heady times post 2005 until we got to the crisis. There were multiple transactions underway across every geography, a huge amount of growth, because we saw the urgency then of doing it now before the rest of the world saw how valuable kind of that big portfolio was.
Yeah.
And I kind of look back on that to back to 1997 when we assessed the Sealand portfolio. In 1997, Sealand was the largest operator of container terminals in the world.
Okay, terminals
just embedded in the regular business.
Yeah.
I think the number we had a count of 35 terminals inside of Sealand all over the world supporting that business. So there was this terminal operating kind of ethos mentality inside of Sealand. And so the scale was really important. That scale fell apart in 99. So kind of looking back on that, the need to build scale was really critical, particularly in a market where key customers were consolidating. And so we were on this path saying to make it work right, we had to scale very quickly. And so led that growth effort before coming back to the US unexpectedly in mid 2009 to take over as CEO for the region. And a very small region it was then in the Americas, because by that point in time, we were kind of shut out of the US. On the back of that P&O steam navigation transaction. And so came back, to lead the region, did that all the way through the end of 2016, was asked to come back to Dubai as global COO for ports and terminals, which I did for 3 more years. And then, I had some family circumstances which needed me back in the US. And so effectively did a job swap with my replacement in the US and came back to the US to take over as CEO again before leaving in 2022. So a total of 18 years as part of kind of that DP World effort, leading as an executive in multiple roles across the organization.
So that's so interesting. One thing that you've said about Sealand, and I guess I didn't realize this, but of course, when I think of Sealand, I think of they had the vessels, they had the ocean shipping, but you said that they also had that strategy of vessels and terminals. And so, that we see today, right? I mean, we kind of see that same model today. I don't know, for some reason, it never clicked. The two
but you have to think back. You have to think back to the beginning of containerization, Lauren, right? If you were the innovator and you were now, moving down this path towards containerization, Well, it's great to containerize. Well, how are you going to work the ship with the containers on it?
Mhm.
You need a terminal.
Yeah.
Well, who's
Yeah.
going to build you a terminal in a market that's uncertain? And
That's
so kind of that next step was, okay, if we're going to put containers on ships, well, we need terminals
Mhm.
to manage the load and discharge of those
Yeah.
containers from the ship and be able to then go to customer.
That's
So you needed a system, not just the idea and not just having a ship with a container on it. You had to build an entire system. And so that really was what Sealand did.
Mhm.
I think even the very first container crane was contracted by Sealand.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Right. So it is the origin, the initiation, kind of that seed kernel of
Mhm.
we start with IDLX and putting those trucks up on deck
Mhm. Mhm.
to carriage. Once you take that container away from the chassis, the box,
Yeah.
you need a whole system to manage.
Yeah.
And so if you're the innovator and you're going to grow, you have to build the system to support it. And it's almost no different than Amazon. If you kind of
Yeah.
look at parallels, it's not enough that you have a system.
Yeah.
How do you get the goods to the door? Well, you need an entire delivery system from your warehouse to door. Whether you do it or your contract to do it, you have to build that ecosystem.
Yeah.
And it's the whole system that is where the value is. It's not just
That's right.
the one piece.
Well, and the reliability of what to expect, right? Because I mean, ocean lines and terminals, I mean that they're each other's kind of biggest customers, essentially, right? So there has to be in today's world, but there has to be a nexus there of reliability of what it's going to look like when you arrive to the terminal, and the best way to know that is to create it and own it yourself, right? I mean,
Well,
what
it was just about having the service. Who was going to
well, that's right.
invest money in building a container facility for a product that no one was sure was going to be the product of the future?
That's right.
It was
That's a good
speculative,
point.
right?
Yeah. That's a
And
good point.
so you did it yourself, and the one negative, the one wrinkle out of that is it was the precursor to what we call today a throughput rate. And so the way a terminal charges a line is from hook to gate. Because Sealand doing it was an accounting exercise.
Yeah, sure.
Right. That Sealand's customer was, like many lines today that own terminals, Sealand's customer was the cargo owner. And so those were co-owned businesses. No one looked at the terminal as an independent operating company.
Yeah.
Which we are today, right?
Yeah,
At Ports
yeah,
America.
exactly.
It's an independent terminal operating company,
Yeah.
unaffiliated.
Yeah.
And so, one of those kind of anomalies of containerization was the creation of a throughput rate.
Yeah.
Places that containerize so much later, Latin America, don't have throughput rates. And so this is a really unique occurrence of kind of U.S. market. The more developed markets have these throughput rates they were the early adopters of containerization.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point you've made too. So, I mean, it's a proof of concept still, right? So you're expanding your proof of concept all around the country. And so that's that terminal generation. And then once the concept was essentially proved, which I'm sure happened very quickly, then all of a sudden other people wanted to get into terminal creation, right? And that's where this competition within terminals created. I said, ocean carriers and terminals, they're kind of each other's biggest customers. Obviously the BCOs, cargo is king, right? So like that
it is all about the cargo.
It is
right?
all
That
about
is
the
the
cargo.
real customer.
Yeah,
in
exactly.
the end, we have a direct customer. Say it might be an ocean liner company, but we all know it's the cargo that we're serving indirectly is the real customer.
Exactly.
Right? This is about facilitating trade and being part of a supply chain. The end of that chain is the BCO.
But I think that's the point that I was trying to make is that the ocean carrier relationship to the terminals and ports it's its own kind of customer relationship at the heart of it, right? I mean, there's a lot of synthesis and it works well, and you don't really know about the competition side of it, but it really is. There's still a competition. There's still a customer element to it all, and so but that's so interesting to see it move from Sealand created it out of necessity, and then it somehow kind of took over and became its own industry.
It evolved into its own business.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
But that's also part of kind of the capital requirements associated with that. It became very unique. So you still have a very large portion of terminals today operated by liner companies and their affiliate terminal operating companies, and then a large portion that are still independent. But I think it also kind of it was really, if you look at that independence, the capital requirements going into terminals are enormous. Probably, not maybe the same as buying a fleet of vessels, which is very capital intensive.
Yes.
but other people doing that relieves capital burden from an ocean liner to invest in all of its own assets.
That's right.
And so that's part of this interplay is these capital intensive businesses may not be able to be effective with single party doing everything throughout. Even, the terminal operating company of MSC, the world's largest ocean shipping company today, TIL, it has financial investors. It's not 100% MSC.
Yeah.
We saw the recent announcement of the transaction with CMA and Stonepeak. There's another, setup of a terminal opco controlled majority owned by CMA, but with financial ownership to essentially defray some of the capital expense for future growth. And so this is not kind of unheard of, right, in the marketplace.
Right. And that's so interesting too. That's the piece of the business, true business of it all. Take away, the industry of the supply chain, but like these are businesses kind of, they could be, it's the piece that I understand the least is how all of the financing and everything kind of goes into it. But it is so fascinating. I mean, we're talking big bucks, right? These are big things, very capital intensive. And of course, to de-risk it, to create more people involved. And it's such an wild thought to me that I can't quite grasp my head around. But when we're talking billions, it's just numbers, right?
Well, I think we almost notionally now in the U.S. use a figure. You build a single berth in the U.S. Is a minimum $500 million, $500 million. So a terminal, you're typically going to build 2 berths, 800 meters of wharf. And I'm sorry, I can't speak in feet. I never learned in feet. I spent an international career. This is science, and I have to think in meters. I couldn't even tell you the length of a vessel, having managed so many vessels, what they are in feet. So it is the international side of me, having spent most of my youth growing up as an expat and then working in an international field. I think in meters.
Your engineering brain is still
it's so much easier. It's just so much easier. So you kind of think notionally, minimum $500 million per berth. You want to build, an 2-berth facility, 800 meters of wharf. You're looking at $1 billion in most locations on a brownfield, right? Greenfield will get more expensive, right? So that's a minimum, right? I look at some projects that are a lot bigger than that. If you look at what's going to be the cost of Pier 500 in LA if it gets developed, like that notionally is going to be a 2-berth facility. It is well over that figure. Yeah. So I think that's part of the realization is that building infrastructure today, and there are 2 things driving that. One is just the pure cost, the engineering cost we have to go through to actually build, but also what we're building to is a market that's very different. Right, the largest vessel that I was part of putting a network together for. I remember we did this in 1996 or 7, and we had planned. Maersk was building new ships, and they identified them, in our network planning map with a number, and the number was a lot less than what they actually built. And these were the first 6,600 TEU ships, right? The original K class. That came out of the Lindo yard. I'm like, that was unheard of. Those were enormous, right? Big ship then was a Panamax container ship, right? These were, 50% larger right out of the gate. There were very few even post-Panamax ship running container trades, right? You had the APL series that had been built that were post-Panamax, but were shorter. So they were over-dimensional. And so that was kind of the start. And what happened over the next 20 years, we went from the largest ship in the world in 1995, essentially on the water, being roughly a Panamax-sized vessel, 4,200 TEU, to 23,000. Yeah. And that scale has put a huge burden on the terminal. Water depth, dock strength, bollards, cranes, even how you operate the yard and require densification to manage that volume has changed the dynamics so dramatically. And so all of those burdens, essentially, while international container lines scale up to create economies of scale to handle this global trade boom, just push this financial problem right down onto the land side. That's right. And it started in the terminal and went out of the terminal and all the supporting infrastructure. And so when COVID happened, and people said, gee, what happened here? I said, it wasn't a problem with the ships. Ships
No,
were
yeah.
working fine.
Yeah.
The ships did not get, back up in San Pedro Bay because there was a problem with the ships.
Yeah,
It was the land side ability to handle that kind of surge.
that's right.
And that is a consequence of the infrastructure actually wasn't there to support it.
And I just want
and
to,
that's really kind of important that people understand that
that's right.
We have to make investments in ports in order to accommodate what those lines are doing on the water.
Yeah, we have to. I just want to highlight, you said 6,000 to 22,000. I mean,
23. I didn't even 24. Right? It's a question mark around that. I haven't looked at a vessel diagram and done the calculation in a long time, but it's in that neighborhood. Now, very few of those actually touch U.S., right? Those are mostly serving in the Asia-Europe trades today.
But we have quite a few, 15 to 18,000 TEUs 18,000
is kind of the sweet spot right now in the U.S. market relative to parcel size, vessel size. I would even say that someone would say, the Neo Mega Panamax size, right? Can get through the new canal, essentially becomes that, and that's in that range.
Yeah. And the other thing too, to remember, right? I mean, when we talk about 24,000 TEUs, it's not an entire offload, an entire unload, because I don't think anyone.
Well, it depends on where you go. Sometimes it is, right? The intensity of work on the West Coast, if you look going to LA Long Beach with an 18,000 TEU ship, it may only be making one call. It may not be making double calls on the West Coast, right? There are some services that are a full discharge load back, right?
Wow.
It's a long time to do that work.
Yeah.
So
that's, I'm on the East Coast, and that's where my experience has been.
Yeah, so East Coast, you're typically making
I'm thinking there's probably 3
calls.
or 4. Yep.
Right.
But no, you're right. I mean, especially on the West Coast, they're less likely to make multiple port calls, and I guess there really could be
some will touch into PNW or into Northern California.
Yeah.
But generally, there's a lot more kind of intensity if you look at parcel size cycles on a large ship coming into LA Long Beach. Those are much bigger.
And that's your point, right? I mean, the efficiency has to be there, because once the box comes off, it can't stay for too long. It's got to move, because there's another 18,000 TEU vessel coming behind it.
Right.
So, and to be fair, right? So when we say TEUs, those are 20-foot equivalent unit versus 40-foot. So the actual number, most containers are probably in the 40-foot versus 20-foot. But even so, I mean, we're still talking more than half that number in 18,000, 9,000 boxes.
Yeah, if you look at this kind of by mix, right? 90% of the containers landing in the U.S. are 40-foot containers.
40s, yeah.
Right, and typically 40-foot high cubes.
Yeah, right.
Which goods, also lighter, right? You need the space in the box.
So that makes rail a little bit difficult, because then if it's a high cube, then is it available to double stack, or I don't think you can. Okay,
it depends on the routing, right?
Okay,
it depends on the routing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So
45s used to be the way we managed in the old day, from a extended off the ISO 40 standard. It kind of went to 45s, but now it's really a 40-foot high cube has become the large size container as a standard.
Okay. Yeah. Versus the 53 foots, which are the over the road trucks that are a little bit different.
Those are domestic. So domestic truck line, typically, trailer, 53 feet.
Yeah.
And so we have a domestic intermodal market that is 53 feet.
Yeah. So you can kind of tell the difference, right? If it came right off a ship, whether it looks like it's a box sitting on top of wheels versus the 53 footers, which are the over the road trucking that you see, through most of the highways away from the ports, where that's where you're going to see it all looks a little bit more seamless. Those are kind of the trucks.
You will see 53s, domestic intermodal on chassis.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So, again, you have 53 shippers in the U.S. today. People like Crowley, right, that are running 53s.
Oh, interesting.
So you do have a trailer bridge running 53s. So you have a 53-foot market. But like I said, the distinction between a trailer and the container and chassis is just simply look at the corners of the box.
Yep.
Right? Is it a corner casting with a twist lock in it? That's all you need to see.
Yep.
It's not integrated to the chassis. It's just locked in.
Yeah. Yep. Well, so we've talked about your global experience here, and one thing that I do want to ask you. So you've had, the scale of operations across the world. You've kind of been all over the place, and you've built it up. So operating at that global level, you've obviously seen different port systems. What are some of the biggest differences, and what are some of the biggest lessons that you think that the U.S. could learn from some of the best practices that you've seen out there? I mean, you also saw, you were there when we were creating the world that we live in now, especially in the U.S. What are some things that we kind of missed the boat on, on updating that we should have, or I don't know. What are some of the best practices?
I don't think we missed the boat on anything.
Okay, good. All right, good.
I think there were more challenges to adopt certain systems in the U.S. than there were internationally. And one thing that people touch on is automation, right? What's happened in terms of bringing in technology that is automation technology into the industry to create sustainable, scalable operations to meet what's happening on the vessels. And people kind of look into the Far East and the level of automation in the Far East. I always kind of touch back, though, and provide the counterpoint that automation, and having been part of several automated terminal developments, automation relies so heavily on scale to be value accretive. And outside of a couple of locations in the U.S., we don't have that same scale. For all intents and purposes, the U.S. from a container terminal handling perspective is a relatively small market, right? Roughly 60 million TEUs handled total in the entire U.S. market, in a year. We went above that during COVID. We're probably going to be right at that level.
Can you say that again? What was the number?
60 million.
60
million TEUs across the U.S. import export in marine.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It doesn't count what comes across, the border of Mexico, which is
in my head. I'm
number.
pairing it with the TEU numbers that we were just talking about, and I was okay.
Right. So you look at that, and then you say Shanghai alone, did 60 million, right? In a single port in China. Mm-hmm. So I guess you're getting close if it's not there, right? Singapore over 40 million in a single port. Now a lot of that's transshipment, right? But not Shanghai. Shanghai's all import export. So single port in China gets close to the entire U.S. market, and that's why I say so. Be careful when we scale, right? Dubai 16 million, right? If you kind of look at one of the largest ports outside of China today, outside of Singapore, right, outside of Asia, is Dubai by metric. 16 million in Dubai, 16 million in that neighborhood. So, there's a large scale port operation, right? It's 15 million, right? 20 million. These are large scale. So then you kind of pair that with, okay, where does automation make sense in terms of scale? And when we've looked at this in detail, and again, done this exercise, for me, it's minimum of 1 million lifts. Minimum. 1 million lifts is 2 million TEUs. How many million single terminals in the U.S. did 1 million lifts, right? They're not many. 1 million lifts is a lot of volume. Yeah. So I think that's in a single terminal. And so that's what we're saying is like this pairing of value accretive automation does require scale on a single terminal in order to implement, because this is the argument I hear from everybody. U.S. way behind in terms of automation. Like automation doesn't really pay unless you have the scale. And if we don't have the scale, then it's really about deployment of appropriate technology on a terminal in order to drive efficiency and productivity to create value. And that's really the ethos that as Ports America we're bringing to the job is, how do we run a terminal today leveraging very experienced longshore labor and do it in a way where we implement and use technology to make them more efficient so that we all have a benefit. And there are models where we can do that. And so maybe that's the biggest difference when we look at US versus other locations is, yes, we still have a dependency on labor to run operations, but that's the same story in Australia today. With the in Canada, it's the same story. These stories aren't different anywhere else. But the ability for us to deploy technology seamlessly to continue to grow, to create opportunity and value for all stakeholders. That's really what we're trying to accomplish as Ports America today, that kind of window, that environment.
That's so interesting too, that it's the necessity-based adoption, right? And so, adopting just for the sake of adopting may or may not be the route, but necessity-based adoption. We can't just go to the Singapore model because we don't have the ability to support that. And we shouldn't just jump there. But, kind of keeping an eye on it is important. But then, continuing to move is important too. So, that sounds great. I mean, I think that's such an important piece, having the exposure to the world, and then now being in charge of Ports America. I'd like to talk a little bit more about Ports America. Obviously you're the CEO and president of Ports America. You've been there since 2022. Now, people who aren't as familiar with the terminal operations or Ports America itself, can you walk us through exactly kind of where Ports America covers, where they might see you, and how it maybe perhaps differs a bit from the traditional just understanding of ports?
Well, so there's two elements here. One is what we do and how we do it are the two. And so, principally Ports America is a combination of a terminal operator and a stevedore. We do both. And so what is that, right? And that distinction, I think, is really important for people to understand. Stevedoring is simply the activity of loading and unloading a ship. And so there are companies that act as stevedores, providing that service, coming onto a work site, managing longshoremen to load and unload ships. That happens in every cargo category today. It happens on roll-on, roll-off ships for those wheel vehicles. It happens in general cargo. It happens in container, right, where you have to load and unload a ship. It even happens in cruise. You don't unload and load passengers, but all of the stores, right, have to go on and off the ship. All of that gets managed by stevedores, and though principally longshore labor managed by a stevedoring company, a licensed stevedoring company. So that's kind of one element, the stevedoring side. Then there is the terminal. And so you have many places where the terminal itself is under a contract with an operating company. And so that's the terminal. So a port authority may contract with an operating company to take a terminal site to operate a terminal for specific use. Again, it could be ro-ro, general cargo, break bulk, container, and an operator will come in under a license to run the entire terminal. And that's from gate to the dock. And they will typically do their own stevedoring in-house as a single entity. So it's a whole company providing a ship-to-gate service, managing the entire terminal ecosystem, all of the container handling, in this case, the load unload of the ship with containers, the storage, and the dispatch, and everything in between. So anything in the boundary of the fence. So essentially, those are the two kind of pieces of the business. And Ports America does both those in all segments. So we're an asset-based operator and a general stevedore, operating across the entire country in all activities. Unlike some other, there are other companies out there that simply focus and only do container and only do terminal operations. Don't get involved in general stevedoring, but we do general stevedoring outside of our asset-based locations all across the country.
And
so it's much more holistic, right? And
yeah.
I say, kind of our biggest, people say, Matt, what does Ports America really do? Well, we manage longshore labor on job sites on behalf of customers. Part of that is the ecosystem of the terminal itself. Part of it's just doing the stevedoring.
But then who better to know kind of that nexus point of how it all works together than the people who are there doing it all? I mean, we in the U.S., obviously, this, but we have both the private ports and the operating ports and the leasing ports. And so, ports like Boston is an operating port. They own and operate and they run it. But Ports America is very present there as part of the stevedoring team versus, actually having terminals elsewhere in those leasing ports. So it's such a unique thing. The moniker is if you've seen one port, you've seen one port, but that can't be more true in the United States.
The models are very different everywhere.
Yeah.
Right? You have pure landlord ports. So again, the difference between a port and a terminal. So you have the Port of LA with all of its business is a landlord port, and it leases out all of its terminals to private operators, lines, and private operating companies to operate terminals. Then you have, the other kind of side of that spectrum, most purely, is GPA, Georgia Ports Authority, operating in Savannah and Brunswick. They're an operating port by definition. We work in Savannah today, are part of a joint venture stevedoring company that does 100% of the container lift on, lift off for for GPA and their customers. So we also have a customer relationship to do the stevedoring, but we do the laydown of that container into the yard that's managed by the Georgia Port Authority, and they do all of the terminal work. So we simply move it from ship to point of rest, and from point of rest back to ship, and are managing, in this case, the longshoreman doing that work. And GPA runs its own terminal from the gate into the yard. So that's where the distinction happens. There are several operating ports, from the container sector in the U.S. Principally kind of this mixed mode operation that Charleston has, Port of Virginia, and Houston, and then you talk about the little one in Boston, kind of how they run Conway. So you have generally this in the U.S. kind of like an operating port model. And then you have the concession model, right? The lease model, which is more the dominant model in the U.S. in terms of locations. It's more that than like the Port of New York is a landlord model where you have tenants that have leases over port land operating facilities.
That's right. And I called it a leasing port. It's a landlord port is the word I was searching for. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So you have operating ports, and
operating and landlord port. Yep, that's right. Thank you. Well, and it's so interesting, right? Because you've mentioned this a few times, but you're working with shipping lines, you're working with port authorities, longshore labor, trucking companies, railroad, cargo owners. I mean, you guys are the nexus point in different avenues for different ports. I mean, you are the nexus point of seeing it all. So how difficult is it to balance all of those relationships, but also how valuable Ports America really is to being part of the conversation that we are now moving into with the administration. So, I mean, you're certainly seeing some of those points where we could, potentially have better operations or there's opportunity for improvement. But speak to me a little bit about kind of that nexus point of being within and connecting to all of these different stakeholders.
Well, I think this is really maybe the most critical point. It isn't just running a terminal to provide a service to a line, and we all recognize, we talked about it earlier, right? The end of that line is the cargo owner, right? Whether they're a consignee or an exporter, right? That's the customer for everybody. And it may not be your principal customer, you may not have a revenue relationship, but ultimately the work that we're doing is serving that customer. So how do we look at that customer, and how do we build capability that recognizes that customer's need? Well, that requires that engagement with that customer. And there are ports that have done this really well, and we'll point to Port of Savannah in terms of their build out of ecosystems to serve trade. It wasn't building an ecosystem to load a ship. And so the sooner we all in the U.S. recognize that the terminal is that nexus, a very critical nexus for trade that does have a duty responsibility to look at the other side, look out of the gate, I call it, right? Don't look across the wharf at the ship, look out of the gate and saying, okay, how are we serving customer? Do we have the right product services in the market to be able to grow and grow efficiently, right? And so we often look at our own, when we look at strategy in our own assets, we're saying, what do we need to serve customer, right? One of the great things that we're doing this year, after many years of development, is opening up the double stack rail service out of Baltimore, right? Been a major, you have a Civil War tunnel that was an impeding factor. The track has been dug out and gone lower to fit on the tunnel.
Interesting.
So we can now, starting in, I think April 21st is the first date of CSX running the train, from our on-dock ICTF, run double stack trains out of Baltimore to Chicago, 802 miles, the closest, most direct route for intermodal from a land side touching water into Chicago ramp. And so for us, that says, okay, well, this is great that we have this new capability to be able to go to market and serve the cargo Columbus, door and Chicago door. But who are those cargo owners, and what services do they need? It's not just about having a rail service. That's what then fills around that, because then you get in the conversation on transload, right? How many are you going to transload, and can we effectively do a transload so that they go inland, not in an international marine container, 40-foot high cube, but they go into a domestic intermodal, right? And that then has to go hand in hand when you look at what does reach need to look like. Is not just talk to the customer. It's really about identifying needs and building and aligning the product and service that the terminal offers in order to best serve the customer so they can grow.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and I think that that's so important too. I didn't realize, I knew that Baltimore was getting close. As many East
It's ready.
Coast, as many
ready.
East Coast ports have, these bridges, which are beautiful. We don't want to touch them. But on the other hand, they were not built for double stack container loads.
No, and in Baltimore, it was really complex because it was the tunnel, the Howard Street tunnel, but then the entire project actually was multiple
Yes.
choke points. There were bridges involved, and the last two, the tunnel was done before, but the last two have been two last bridges that need to be modified.
That's interesting. But it was a dive, not a build up. It was a dive down
Yeah,
lower.
they went. So they dug out the tunnel deeper. Right? This is old, old 19th century tunnel. Right? So you could, if you ripped out the entire stone,
you'd rip it. Yeah, like
wall,
it'd be done.
the whole thing's going to collapse.
Yeah,
so
exactly. Yeah.
they essentially shored up on the foundation along the perimeter, and then dug down
That is so
to create the vertical space.
Well, and I've often said that, rail as a commodity for ports and terminals is the future. I mean, it has to, all of the different availabilities, right, are so critical of kind of increasing fluidity, right? If we ever want to get to this 60 million in one port, it has to have everything firing on all cylinders. And rail is a critical piece to that. And so, bridge height limitations are tough, but that's fantastic that's been done. Preserve the integrity of the bridge.
Just a great example of, it's not just about the asset you build on the water side.
Yes.
Not just about the systems. You really have to look at where you're going to and how do you get there. And it's a supply chain. It's not one link in the supply chain. Yeah. And so if you want to operate effectively, you have to look at the whole chain and understand there are lots of links there and how do those get addressed.
And that's what you were kind of alluding to with the COVID challenges on the West Coast, right? It wasn't just that the vessels couldn't get in and out. It was that there was nowhere for those containers to go. It wasn't able to turn around. And once one little piece started to slow down, then it kind of slowed everything.
It just stacks
and then you
up,
just
right?
didn't have any space on the yard for new containers to go, right? It had to be moving. So, I think we all learned a lot during that time, but also it kind of highlighted how just critical the entire infrastructure around a port is, not just to the port itself, but getting it out to market. It was tough for a lot of reasons, but also so fascinating to see some of these choke points kind of highlighted, and I say that not with glee, but with just fascination of how, highlighting, okay, well, here are points that we need to make sure that they get better, right?
Well, it simply was a great kind of awakening, visible point, almost the start of a call to action to say, we have a problem and we need to do something about it.
Yes.
And it really is kind of this precursor to saying, well, what's going on? Everybody kind of taking a deeper dive. And that is really what's gotten us to kind of where we are today.
That's right.
It's about maritime.
Yes.
When we step back and recognize that the entire U.S. economy is built on trade and it's international trade, how are we serving that? And do we have a sustainable model to do that in the future? And people started looking at that and saying, ooh, maybe we actually need a plan or two, right, that can be implemented. Yeah. And that's really what's brought us in the dialogue for today is those crisis points that are so critical. And one thing that I've mentioned to you in the past, Lauren, is this kind of over dependency on a couple of critical gateways, right? Most of the cargo imports we have today are containerized, right, for general cargo, and the preponderance. And those are coming through 5 or 6 gateways into the country, right? Sure. The majority. And so I'm been a big advocate, right, in my own kind of work of creating new opportunities, relevant gateways to move cargo to create a sustainable future for cargo management. If we simply over-rely on 5 ports, right, that's not good for the U.S., right? One of the things I raise, and I think I raised it to you, God forbid we had a major cataclysmic earthquake in Southern California that would take 1/3 of our containerized port infrastructure offline for a period of time. We thought COVID was bad.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
How are we planning around, and doing risk management around our, kind of infrastructure? And that's really, for me, kind of one of these real hard questions that, What's the best way to move goods to market? What are the alternatives? Do we have multiple choice, multiple lanes for everybody? And everybody's not just forced to take, cargo coming out of the Far East into Southern California to go inland. That may work great in terms of scale, but it's not so great in terms of resilience. And there's a balance that we have to achieve between a kind of resilient supply chain system and one that scales for efficiency. And that's a risk, dialogue.
Yeah. Yeah. And, so when I work with commodity-based shipper groups and that sort of thing, that was one lesson I think we learned after COVID was diversifying ports of entry and diversifying just the networks that you use and being capable and ready. And it's not an or necessarily, it's an and, right? It's a, okay, make sure that you're building that in. It's not necessarily taking away from any of these fantastic gateway ports, but it's also building it in so that way when things come up, right? There was some labor discussions coming up, these, especially those that kind of took that advice, were ready for that and they were able to shift because it wasn't an entirely new market that they had to learn. They already had kind of a connection and familiarity with a diversified port of entry. And so that really good advice, because I think that that's something that everybody is looking at, whether it's export or import, but just knowing those networks, because each and every one of them is so unique and different that you have to be able to know who to call and who's, if you had to switch it within a week, right, then you need that familiarity baseline because you're not going to switch it in a week if you didn't already know much about it. You might. There's some people that are really good.
But I think, kind of the one of the issues here, Lauren, is who makes that decision? Who's driving that train, metaphorically speaking? Yeah. No pun intended. Is it the international container line, or is it the cargo owner, the consignee? And is the consignee does control in the end, but are they doing a good enough job with doing it? Because if you're that line, you're looking at scale to drive value, and you want your 18,000 TEU ship. You don't want it to go to 5 ports. You want that to go to 3 ports and only 3 ports. And you want to do your moves, access broad regions. So the lines effectively are running a network that has created this over-dependency on a couple of key ports. And if we were running a network of 4,000 TEU ships, it would be very, very different model today. So the lines themselves, when they scaled up, created large scale port infrastructure serving these big parcel sizes, big ships in New York, LA, Long Beach, Houston, Savannah, right? There's the kind of ecosystem, right, of big in the US today. And then you have kind of the next grouping kind of below that. Those are the big ports. And how much more can we push, right, rationally through that system and do it effectively? And we can create, kind of models of, okay, if you're a receiver of cargo and you're based, in Central Florida, do you take your cargo into Savannah and truck down from Savannah, or do you take it in Tampa and drive an hour? Well, today with service opportunities in Tampa, because of its size, are not as much choice as going to Savannah, which has scale. But from an end cost perspective and a dependency perspective, Tampa might be better. And but it's getting that customer to actually say, I want port of discharge Tampa as the driver of that choice to get the lines to put the service into Tampa to serve their needs. And that's this kind of interplay between what does line want to do? As few port calls as possible. Yeah. What does customer really want? Choice. Do they understand what they can get if they ask for it? And do they carry the weight to get it? And that's kind of where, when I look at this ecosystem, where I think, in the end, it's the supply chain executives for the major PCOs that need to be much more specific about what they want. Not, I want this at Columbus Ramp and let the line choose how it gets there. Like they control the system. They just simply have to ask for it.
Well, and it's interesting too, because I think that there's a lot more availability of actually moving around to ports from the carriers, from the lines, because of these ocean alliances that, often kind of get a bad rap, but it actually kind of makes more vessels available for maneuvering around to different ports of entry or ports of export. Because instead of 5 vessels doing the same route half full, now they can kind of move that and share that space. And that's all it is, right? It's a vessel sharing operation. situation. They're still competing for your goods, but that way it kind of makes maybe 2 or 3 of those vessels that were on that otherwise 5 vessels go in the same area available to go to some more diversified ports. And so, I think your point is well made that, the BCO and the customer there has a bigger voice than they think they do, and they can help impact some of that choice that they're looking for. One thing that I want to make sure that we do hit with Ports America, though, there are inevitably initiatives and major priorities for you as Ports America, as part of your board, as part of your members. Can we go through some of those? And then I'd like to kind of incorporate that into how you see them playing out in the Maritime Action Plan that was recently released. So what are some of the priorities that you and your members have, but then how are you seeing that kind of relay into real life in the Maritime Action Plan?
I would say not necessarily direct connected to the action plan, which is a little more broader, strategic, that's kind of serving a national need. And we're very supportive, and I've been very public about the principles that are in that plan. We support, I support, certainly had a lot of voice in the creation of that plan overall. So it's a topic we can hold for another day, but I'm very excited about it. There's some things that we're going to have to calibrate to get right overall, particularly on the cargo tonnage tax to support the Maritime Security Trust Fund. But pull back to Ports America. I mean, one of the things certainly coming on board that we've been really focused on as an enterprise is conversations around productivity and efficiency, right? That we have to be top game, right, in terms of service that we provide for users of terminals. And that's a journey that we've been on inside Ports America since I came on board, this relentless focus on productivity and efficiency. That drives value for our liner customers, creates opportunity for our cargo customers simultaneously, right? We can't talk about technology and systems if we're not actually running it right. And so this comes with that kind of relentless discipline on being the best in terms of how we operate. So that's kind of start one, right? You have to be that good before you can talk about all the other things. But we also had a really big focus, kind of on understanding and realigning that this is not a business that we run that is just serving a liner company, regardless of cargo type. It's a business that serves an end customer, directly or indirectly. And are we doing what we need to do to manage, to create value for that end customer? And that starts with an engagement, understanding what the needs are. And then it goes back to building pieces to that overall, whether that's around a gate system, whether it's around how empties are returned, whether it's around storage, whether it's around dispatch on rail services, whatever it is, that it's not good enough just to manage your marine side productivity and load and unload a ship. And we say that's not the end of the job. It really requires another element: know the customer and build towards customer need long term. And that's this journey, for me that ultimately that we're on at Ports America is kind of the realignment of the enterprise, being a very large scale U.S. operator that was very good, had a great track record. One that came out of one of the residual spinoffs of DP World in 2007. So there's a little bit of history there too that we didn't touch on. And so all these great things, right? In terms of safety, workplace management, relationship with labor, all build towards that kind of directive of efficiency, productivity. And we don't do it unless it's safe. Starts right there. How do we work? And then build the right process procedures around, creating sustainable production as efficiently as possible. And then be ruthless about how we look at the land side. What do we need?
Well, and so one of the things, so I take your point on that the Maritime Action Plan doesn't necessarily directly hit, some of the things. Obviously, it talks about larger kind of scale and larger plans. But one of the things that didn't, kind of made it in, but not quite, but an idea of a national port strategy or ports infrastructure strategy. What are your reactions to that? Because
I'm a huge advocate. I've publicly advocated for that for a long time.
Well, let's speak about it with the competition side, right? Because I come from an FMC minded, right? We have competition amongst our ports and terminals. So, but the infrastructure cannot be dismissed on that each port is kind of really good at what they're really good at. Some are good at more than one thing, but the ports and terminals and then the infrastructure around it, it makes sense to have some sort of a strategy.
There has to be, and again, I look at it this way, Lauren. If we do 60 million last year, what are we going to do in 2040, 15 years from now? 90 million? Okay, so where's 30 million TEU of capacity going to come from to handle that market growth, right? You're assuming some level of utilization that we're running at today that's reasonably comfortable.
Mhm.
You effectively need 25 or 30 million TEUs of incremental capacity.
Mhm.
Where is that going to be provided? How and by whom? And that's kind of this broader, like, okay, is there a stock nationally where you have every port authority is a local authority, city and or state, sometimes multi-counties, depending on where you are, like New Orleans, multi-parish. But it is effectively localized, not federalized. We don't have a federal port authority like many countries do. So we have states and we have local jurisdictions that own the ports. And so how do we get alignment across that ecosystem to implement a strategy that's good for national strategy? And the number one thing there, and I like it in the same way to highway tax, right? Gasoline tax to support interstate highways, right? There's a federal use tax on the sale of gasoline, and the federal government decides where the international highway system goes and what gets funded in terms of development or co-funded. And so we have access to capital, and certainly we'll have more access to capital with the Maritime Security Trust Fund implementation. How is the money spend going to be prioritized that aligns to that national freight strategy across, say, containers? And again, the federal government carries weight because it has the money. Doesn't need to have a federal port authority. Says, okay, we've got a PIDP funding mechanism, and we're taking $1 billion a year out of the Security Trust Fund to put into infrastructure, and then some rigor around, okay, what's everybody's plans, right? And I said, okay, well, here's a prioritization from a federal side. We're funding these 3. Right? It doesn't have to be everybody gets $1 million, right? 5 projects get the money, and those go forward. Everybody else, you fight for what you fight for. So there's a way to kind of manage that system, but it needs to be directed. What's a priority on a national basis, and how do we fund those?
So do you think that it would be better suited as an entire national maritime strategy or as a national ports and terminals strategy?
I think it's a national ports and terminal strategy that's a subset of the national maritime strategy. It's not separate. It is part of that. Right. And that was why kind of and we're digressing a little bit onto the map. Getting port, the land side, included into the CCF. Where we can go out and buy a very expensive crane and get some tax relief for doing that to equalize large pricing that we're paying today, right? So those are great elements that bring into the conversation kind of workarounds to inefficiencies that have been created by a tariff plan. And so those are all kind of feeding each other inside of that action plan. And I think the most important one, though, really comes back to establishing the Maritime Security Trust Fund. Very akin to the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund and the Harbor Maintenance Tax, right? Having a source of receipts to go into a fund, and the fund purpose is clear, and then there is a body that's managing disbursement from that fund to go into projects. And this is a catch-up for us, right? We're in this pressure, this undue pressure of, and I mentioned it before, on the container side, lines have brought big ships. It's made infrastructure that we currently operate obsolete. We have to go make investments long before the cranes have reached their useful life, long before the dock reaches useful life, in order to handle that ship. Well, we didn't get the economic value out of 30 years of use of a crane and 50 years of use of a dock before the big ship came. And now what do we do, right? So we're kind of under the gun saying we had a plan, but the market outgrew that, driven by some outside forces. How do we keep pace? And that's why this funding process is really critical in order for the market to meet the needs and match up properly with the demand.
And your point earlier, right, about it's got to be kind of an incremental increase. We have to stay ahead of it, but we don't need to stay, like you said, 60 million per port ahead of it, but we do need to stay ahead of it. So, we don't have to go all the way. But, that's interesting too, because when we first started talking about Maritime Action Plan, it was the, for tonnage. It's the 1 cent or 25 up to 25 cent per kilogram. But if there is a strategy on the other side of it, it's something you could probably get behind. But just taxing for the purpose of taxing to potentially have the slush fund, it's got to have more of a strategy to it.
It's again, it has to be the starting point, right?
Mhm.
We're using the funds, and here's how they're going to go over here in order to implement.
Yeah.
That has to be linked,
Yeah.
and then we also have to do some calibration on the best way to put a usage tax in.
Yeah.
We have a very effective harbor maintenance tax.
Yeah.
And some would argue that a tonnage tax on a cargo, on import cargo, isn't necessarily fair and equitable. And so that's one dialogue that's going to have to be open. It's like, how do we get to the best, application of some level of usage charge in order to create the required funding to execute the plan?
Yeah.
Right? We could even have a dialogue. Well, what, 1 cent versus 25 cents? Well, that's a big difference.
Yeah.
How much money do we need?
Yeah.
If we only need $6 billion, well, you don't need 25-cent tax, right? So for me, it all starts with what are we trying to solve for?
Yeah. Yeah.
Here's what the need is annually. Okay, that translates into a fee-based system. And here's how you create that fee-based system. And here's one that's fair and equitable. Okay, implement.
That's right. Yeah.
It's not that hard in the end.
Well, and it's interesting too, right? I mean, because you take so harbor maintenance tax is ad valorem based on the value. And then this new tonnage tax is based on the weight. And so commodities like meat are going to get hit both ways, right? It's high value, it's heavy cargo, and so on the other hand, what industry is more likely to go straight to a tariff tax, harbor maintenance tax waiver that requires or incentivizes you to use US flag than the ones that are getting hit both sides on some of these taxes? So you might be preparing yourself for cargo availability on a US flag. But in the meantime, I think your point on the fairness, I mean, it's not just meat, right? There's other commodities that are high value. I think there's building materials can sometimes fall into that high value, heavy cargo loads. But I think that they are, unfortunately right now, they are getting hit. Some of these commodities are being prioritized, and so they are being given breaks. But on the other hand, it is still tough. And how do you get there? Because we still have to get there. So how do we get there? How do we get money into this trust fund? What backs do we put it on? And that's kind of the ultimate thing.
Yeah. And the corollary conversation I would always get to is, so there's an exception for US flag. So how do we make the US flag affordable?
Yeah.
Right. And listen, I ran a network. I ran US flag tonnage, 30 years ago. I understand the cost difference. How do we make it less onerous to fly the US flag?
Yeah.
Right. That's a bigger conversation. And that's one that MARAD, ultimately, in my mind, needs to solve.
Yeah.
Right. It can't just be Coast Guard solving that. Right. This is a MARAD responsibility. I've mentioned it to Sanyi. This is one that is part of the issue, is the cost to carry that flag.
Sure.
So are there ways for us to not water it down from a security perspective, not water it down from a license perspective, make it easier? Can we streamline US flag so that cost differential to operate US flag is so much smaller?
Sure. Yeah.
And that will help then, right? International lines to meet those requirements. That ultimately, I think everybody would say, can we get the preponderance of US trade operated, served into the US market under US flag?
Yeah.
And so you have to solve both ways, right? It's not just build the ships, right?
Yeah.
That's a long play. But we need US flag conversions. So we have to address the flag cost.
Sure.
And not just kind of create these arbitrary barriers through taxation to say, okay, we're going to tax it enough so you'll do it.
Yeah.
That's not the best way to solve that
right.
problem. There are other ways to approach it. And I think that's why I kind of look at what's the source of the problem. Why does US flag cost so much? And can we solve for that?
Yeah.
So, and that's a whole host of issues inside of that kind of packet of detail.
Well, and I think that that's such an important piece too, because I think that there are, it's going to be a holistic view, and it's going to be a shifting holistic view, right? As we kind of hit economies of scale or certain points that those cost structures are changing, whether intentionally or just by scalability, I think that's where we're going to continue to monitor it. And, before we started, you said this isn't going to be a 5 or 10 year fix, but what do you think, how far do you think we can get in 5 or 10 years?
I think we can get very far. Right. And I think that kind of that far view reach, we're not going to get onto I think we can have a solution, say, for what we're going to do on container handling equipment. That can be put in place. so that we've got a long-term solution from that. If I look at it purely from the port side, we can get the plan in place. We can get the funding source, in place. We can have better dialogue around, what's happening in the industry. I don't think we can get meaningfully, scale up ship construction where that is kind of where I call these asset-based, the heavy infrastructure. If we are truly going to go back, because it wasn't even if I look back 30 years ago, how many U.S. built ships were there of large scale tonnage, right? They were only building to serve, the International Container Jones or the National Container Jones Act trades, right? It was, the ships that Matson were building. So I think getting to the shipbuilding scenario, that has been nearly a century, right? 80 years of kind of degradation, right? It goes back to World War II when we last had kind of viable ship construction capability at scale. And so that's a lot harder to get back to. That's going to take the generation to essentially rescale an industry that has capacity for both military and commercial tonnage that is done in the U.S. That's the long play. Yeah. We can get there, but that's the 30-year reach.
That's right. But you know how we get there?
All the plans in place, all the sources to fund it, right, in the shorter term. But getting that done to scale is going to take a generation.
That's right. But you know how we get there? One step at a time. And we're starting to take steps. Well, thank you so much, Matt, for your time today. Before I leave you, how can people get in touch with you in Ports America?
Listen, I'm pretty accessible. I'm on LinkedIn. My email is accessible through the website. So I don't hide at all. So,
wonderful.
So generally, if people do want to get in touch, generally I'm pretty liberal and reach back through LinkedIn is maybe the best way to get me from a business perspective. Or ask a friend, because always ask a friend. They'll probably give me my mobile number too. So,
right. That's right. Well, this is an industry of passion and friends, so I appreciate that. Well,
absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your perspective. It's always so valuable to hear from leaders who are working at the operational center of the supply chain, where global shipping, port infrastructure, labor, and domestic transportation kind of all come together. As the maritime industry continues thinking about the future, whether that's through this Maritime Action Plan, infrastructure investments, which are continue to be needed strategically, and broader conversations about supply chain resilience, the role of ports and terminals operators is clearly going to remain a critical part of that discussion. I really appreciate you taking the time to walk us through your career, the work that Ports America is doing, and how you see the industry evolving from here. Matt Leech, President and CEO of Ports America, thank you for joining me today.
It's been an immense pleasure, Lauren. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Matt, thank you again for taking the time to join me and share your perspective. Conversations like this really help connect the broader industry discussion with the perspectives from the companies actually operating within the system every day. And hearing about Matt's career progression and how those experiences inform the way he approaches decision-making in his current role is incredibly valuable. Matt Leech, President and CEO of Ports America, thank you for joining me on By Land and By Sea. And thank you as well to the team at Ports America for helping to facilitate this conversation. If you like this episode, be sure to follow, subscribe, and leave a review. Want to go deeper on these topics or bring this kind of insight to your team? Visit themaritimprofessor.com to explore corporate trainings, tailored briefings, and on-demand webinars, all designed to make complex maritime regulations practical and easy to understand. And if your organization needs help navigating the legal or strategic side of ocean shipping regulations, head over to Squall Strategies. That's where I provide consulting services, regulatory guidance, and policy support for clients working in and around the global ocean supply chain as it relates to the FMC and U.S. shipping. As always, this podcast is for educational purposes only and not legal advice. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. So until next time, I'm Lauren Began, the Maritime Professor, and you've just listened to By Land and By Sea. See you next time.